What happened to the wives left behind after the watchers fell? Scripture barely whispers it, but ancient texts say heaven sent Michael himself to end what they became. A judgment so severe it was almost erased from memory entirely. There is a moment in the ancient record that most believers never hear about, not because it was hidden by God, but because it was too heavy for the compilers of Scripture to leave fully exposed. It concerns what happened after the fall. After 200 angels broke rank in heaven and took human wives on the slopes of Mount Hermon, Genesis gives us a single haunting sentence about it and then moves on, as if the writer himself could not bear to linger. But other texts, older fragments preserved by faithful hands, do not move on so quickly. They tell us that judgment did not end with the giants. It did not end with the flood waters rising over Nephilim bones. There was another judgment, quieter, more personal, and it was aimed directly at the women who had been drawn into the Watchers' rebellion. Who were these wives really? Scripture calls them daughters of men, ordinary women living ordinary lives until heaven itself reached down and disrupted the created order. The Book of Enoch tells us the Watchers did not simply appear to them, they taught them. They gave them knowledge no human generation had been meant to carry, secrets of metallurgy, of cosmetics, of enchantments, of root cutting and sorcery. Hazazel taught men to make swords and shields, and the text says he taught women the art of beautifying the eyelids, of decorating the body in ways designed to inflame desire rather than reflect the image of God. This was not romance in the way we imagine it today. This was engineered seduction, a corruption of intimacy itself, and the wives who received these gifts became something other than what they were created to be. Deuteronomy 32 speaks of Israel sacrificing to demons they did not know, gods their fathers had not feared. Some scholars believe this is a distant echo of exactly what took place in those early days, when the boundary between heaven and earth blurred, and humanity began worshipping what should have remained servants of the Most High. The Book of Jubilees adds another layer, describing how the earth itself became filled with violence because of what these unions produced. Not simply because giants walked the land, but because an entire order of existence had been rewritten by disobedient hands. This is where Michael enters the account, and his role is unlike anything else assigned to him in Scripture. We know Michael as the warrior prince, the one who stands for Daniel's people, the archangel who contends with the devil himself over the body of Moses in the book of Jude. But in the Enochian tradition, God gives Michael a task that is almost unbearable in its weight. He is told to go to the wives of the Watchers, the very women who had been used as instruments in this celestial betrayal, and to execute judgment upon them, not from cruelty, from necessity, because what had been unleashed through them could not simply be forgiven and forgotten. It had to be stopped at the root. Enoch chapter 10 records the command with startling directness. God speaks to Michael and tells him to bind Azazel, to cast him into darkness until the day of judgment, and then, in that same breath, to deal with the wives of the angels who had corrupted themselves. The text uses language that suggests these women, having received forbidden knowledge and having birthed children of unnatural origin, could not remain as they were. Their bodies, their bloodlines, had become part of the very rebellion God was moving to erase from the earth. This was not a punishment born of anger toward women as a category. It was a surgical removal of contamination from a world about to be washed clean by the flood. Think about the weight Michael must have carried in that moment. This is the same being who, according to Jewish tradition, pleaded on behalf of humanity before the throne. The one who is called a Prince of Israel, a protector, a defender. And yet here he is, commanded to be the hand of judgment against women who in some sense were victims of a seduction they never fully understood the cost of. This tension between mercy and necessity, between protection and purification, sits at the heart of why this story was so carefully guarded, so rarely spoken of from pulpits. It does not fit neatly into simple categories of good and evil. It forces us to ask what happens when innocence is exploited by powers far beyond human comprehension, and what heaven is willing to do to restore what was broken. The Genesis Apocryphon found among the Dead Sea Scrolls gives us another glimpse, describing Lamech's fear that his own wife Bitanosh had been visited by one of the Watchers, that his son Noah might not even be fully human. Whether or not this fear was founded, It shows us how deeply this crisis had penetrated the human family. No one could be certain anymore who their children truly belonged to. This was the world Michael was sent to correct, a world where the line between heaven and earth, between divine and human, had been shattered by desire and disobedience. What survived after that judgment? After the wives, after the giants, after Azazel bound in chains beneath the earth, was a narrower path. A remnant, Noah's family, untouched, carried forward. Everything else, the corrupted lineage, the false knowledge, the idols the watchers' wives had likely been taught to fashion, was meant to be swept away in the flood that followed. This is why the story of Michael's confrontation with the wives is not a side note. It is the hinge point, the moment that made Noah's preservation even possible. Without it, some ancient writers believed, there would have been nothing left worth saving. We are only beginning to uncover what this judgment meant, and what it reveals about the lengths heaven will go to protect what is sacred. If this story moves something in you, if you feel the weight of what was almost lost before the flood ever came, you need to see what else has been preserved outside the pages most people ever read. Our premium illustrated biblical mystery guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, walks you through every layer of this hidden history, the Watchers, the Giants, and the world that existed before everything changed. It is richly illustrated, deeply sourced, and built for those who want more than the surface version of this story. You will find the link waiting for you in the very first pinned comment below. And if these forgotten judgments speak to something in your spirit, something searching for the parts of Scripture the modern church rarely touches, subscribe to this channel now. There is so much more of this hidden record waiting to be uncovered, and I do not want you to miss what comes next. To understand why heaven chose Michael specifically for this task, we have to go back further, to the moment the rebellion actually began. Not the moment it was discovered, but the moment 200 watchers stood together on the summit of Hermon and bound themselves by an oath. Enoch names them. Semjaza, their leader, who feared taking this step alone, and made the others swear a mutual curse, binding themselves to the plan and to each other so that no one could later claim innocence. This detail matters more than it seems. This was not a single angel falling to temptation in a weak moment. This was organized, deliberate, agreed upon in advance. 200 beings who had stood in the presence of God chose together to descend and take wives from among the daughters of men. Genesis 6 tells us the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. That single verse has puzzled readers for thousands of years, and institutional teaching has often tried to soften it, suggesting it means something more symbolic, perhaps the descendants of Seth mixing with the line of Cain. But the older Jewish tradition, the one Enoch preserves and the one Jude and 2 Peter both seem to accept without question, reads it plainly. Angels, actual heavenly beings, crossing a boundary God had never intended crossed. Jude verse 6 speaks of angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their own abode, being kept in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Peter echoes this almost word for word, describing angels who sinned being cast into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. Why would the apostles themselves treat this account as settled truth rather than metaphor, quoting Enoch directly as though it carried real weight? Because the world they lived in still remembered fragments of what Enoch had recorded generations earlier. It was only much later, as church councils began shaping a narrower canon, that Enoch was pushed to the margins, not because anyone proved it false, but because its contents unsettled a tidier picture of the cosmic order that institutions were trying to build. What makes this section of the story so unsettling is not simply that it happened, but what it produced. The Watchers did not just marry these women. They fathered children through them, and Enoch describes those children as giants, beings of enormous size and appetite who began consuming everything around them. First the produce of the land, then the animals, and eventually, when nothing else remained, they turned on humanity itself. The text says the earth complained about the lawless ones, that it brought accusation against them before the throne of God. Creation itself was groaning under the weight of what these unions had unleashed. This is not folklore invented to frighten children. This is a documented crisis, described in careful detail, of a world being unmade from the inside by a rebellion that started in heaven and ended in bloodshed on earth. And here is where the wives re-enter the story, because they were not passive bystanders to any of this. According to the text, the Watchers did not simply take these women as partners, they opened something in them. Knowledge poured through this union that was never meant to reach human hands so early, if at all. Enoch tells us specifically what was taught. Azazel taught the making of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, the art of war itself given as a wedding gift to mankind. But alongside this, he taught women the working of metals, the making of bracelets and ornaments, and the use of dye and cosmetic arts that changed the very appearance of the human face. Amazarak taught the cutting of roots. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Each watcher brought a different corruption, and the wives who received this knowledge became carriers of it, teaching it further, spreading it through their households and their children. This is the part of the story that institutional religion rarely wants to sit with, because it complicates the simple picture of villain and victim. These women were beautiful, chosen, desired by beings far beyond human power, but they were also transformed by what they received. Their bodies bore children that were not fully human. Their minds carried secrets that were never meant to belong to mortal understanding. Whether by consent or by overwhelming persuasion from creatures who could appear as messengers of light, these wives became embedded in a rebellion whose consequences reached every corner of the ancient world. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians that Satan himself can transform into an angel of light, and if that kind of deception was possible for a fallen archangel, imagine what 200 watchers, still carrying remnants of their former glory, could have offered ordinary women who had never encountered anything like them. This was not a fair encounter between equals. It was a mismatch of power dressed in the language of desire, and the women who were pulled into it likely had no framework for understanding what was actually happening to them until it was already far too late to turn back. Baalbek's massive stones, larger than anything human tools of that era could reasonably lift, are sometimes pointed to by researchers as evidence of a lost capability, knowledge or strength that did not originate from ordinary human hands. Göbekli Tepe, built thousands of years before what we are told civilization was capable of, raises the same uncomfortable question. What if some of what we call ancient mystery is actually the residue of exactly what Enoch describes? A world where the boundary between heaven and earth had been broken open, and things poured through that were never meant to reach us. Psalm 82 speaks of God standing in the congregation of the mighty, judging among the gods, addressing beings who were given authority and abused it terribly. Some scholars connect this psalm directly to the fallen watchers, divine beings who were meant to govern with justice, and instead corrupted everything under their care. If this connection holds, then the judgment against them was not sudden or arbitrary. It was the outcome of a long pattern of rebellion, one that started with pride, moved into deception, and ended with an entire class of heavenly beings being stripped of their place and bound for a judgment still to come. This is the world Michael was preparing to walk into. Not a simple battlefield with a clear enemy in front of him, but a tangled web of corrupted bloodlines, stolen knowledge, and women who had become something other than what they were created to be, through no full understanding of what they had agreed to. The next command God gives him will show us exactly how heaven intended to unravel what had been done, and why the wives themselves could not simply be left as they were. God's instructions to Michael in the 10th chapter of Enoch are layered, and each layer matters. First, he tells Michael to inform Noah of the flood to come so that his line would be preserved. Then he turns his attention to Azazel, commanding that he be bound hand and foot and thrown into darkness, a pit in the desert called Dudael, covered with rough and jagged rocks, so that he would see no light and remain there until the great day of judgment. But the instruction does not stop with Azazel. The text moves immediately into what must happen to Semjaza and the others who conspired with him, and to the fruit of their union with human wives. Here is where the account becomes almost too heavy to read quickly. Enoch writes that the earth had been corrupted through the teaching of the works of Azazel, and that to him should be ascribed the whole of the sin. This is important because it tells us judgment was not distributed evenly out of vengeance. It was measured according to responsibility, according to who initiated the corruption and who was drawn into it. The wives in this framework occupy a strange middle position. They were recipients of forbidden knowledge, but they were also transformed by it in ways that made their continued presence in the created order untenable as the flood approached. We see this same principle of measured responsibility elsewhere in Scripture, where those who initiate wrongdoing bear a heavier weight than those drawn into it unknowingly. James writes that whoever knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin, implying that ignorance and full knowledge are never judged identically. The wives may not have grasped the full cosmic weight of what they received when the watchers began teaching them, but ignorance does not erase consequence, especially when the consequence involves creation itself being rewritten by forces never meant to touch human hands. Numbers chapter 31 gives us something worth pausing on here. A moment when Israel confronts Midian, and Moses commands specific treatment for the women who had led Israel into idolatry through Baal-peor. It is a difficult text, and it is not identical to what happened with the watchers' wives, but the underlying principle echoes across both accounts. When corruption becomes embedded not just in belief but in bloodline and practice, ancient judgment sometimes required a complete severing rather than a gradual correction. This is deeply uncomfortable for modern readers, and it should be. But it helps us understand the scale of what heaven determined necessary regarding what the watchers had done to creation itself. The Book of Jubilees offers a slightly different angle on all this. It describes the giants beginning to slay one another, consumed by their own violence, until the earth itself was filled with bloodshed and injustice from their hands. Jubilees says that God saw the earth was corrupted, that all flesh had corrupted its way, and that this corruption began specifically with the descent of the watchers and what they produced through their unions with human women. The wives, then, were not incidental characters in a footnote. They were the vessels through which an entire corrupted order entered the world, one that had to be undone before the flood could serve its purpose of renewal rather than mere destruction. What makes Michael's assignment so unusual within angelic tradition is that nowhere else in Scripture do we see him assigned a task involving judgment against human beings directly. Daniel chapter 12 describes him as the great prince who stands watch over the sons of Daniel's people, a protector during unprecedented distress. Revelation 12 shows him at war with the dragon, casting Satan and his angels out of heaven entirely. In every other appearance, Michael's role is protective, or it is directed against clearly demonic power. This is the exception. This is the moment where the line between protecting humanity and purifying humanity becomes almost impossible to separate. Some rabbinic commentary from later Jewish tradition attempts to soften this account, suggesting that the wives were transformed rather than destroyed, turned into other beings entirely, stripped of their humanity as part of what was done to correct the imbalance they had become part of. Other traditions are more severe, suggesting a complete removal from the earth alongside the giants themselves. The texts do not agree perfectly, and this disagreement itself tells us something. Even those who preserved this story across centuries were wrestling with how far mercy could extend once a corruption had become this deeply woven into creation. There is a pattern here that repeats throughout Scripture. Whenever holiness confronts something that has been permanently altered by unauthorized contact with the divine. The Ark of the Covenant could not simply be touched by careless hands, as Uzzah discovered when he reached out to steady it and was struck down instantly. According to the account in 2 Samuel, Mount Sinai itself could not be touched by ordinary feet, while God's presence rested upon it, under penalty of death, as we read in Exodus 19. Holiness and corruption cannot occupy the same space without one giving way to the other. And what happened between the watchers and their wives created exactly this kind of unstable, dangerous proximity between the human and the divine, one that could not simply be left to resolve itself naturally. Leviticus repeats this warning again in the instructions given to the priesthood that anything brought too close to what is holy without proper preparation risks being consumed rather than blessed by it. This was never presented as arbitrary cruelty on God's part. It was presented as the natural consequence of mismatched proximity, the same way fire consumes what it touches, regardless of intention. The wives of the Watchers had been drawn into a proximity with the divine that human nature was never built to sustain, and the unraveling of that proximity, however difficult to read now, followed the same pattern Scripture shows us again and again whenever the sacred and the corrupted collide without mediation. This is why Michael's confrontation with the wives cannot be read as cruelty. It has to be understood within a framework where an entire category of existence, human wives bearing children through beings who were never meant to reproduce with mortals, represented a violation so fundamental that only direct angelic intervention could address it. Enoch describes this violation using language that suggests it was not simply moral corruption, but ontological corruption, a break in the very fabric of what was meant to remain separate between heaven and earth. As the floodwaters began to rise, this separation would become final. Noah's family would be preserved, sealed within the ark, untouched by the corruption that had spread everywhere else. But before that could happen, the corruption itself, embodied in the giants in Azazel's chains, and in what remained of the Watchers' wives, had to be dealt with directly. Michael's obedience in this moment is rarely discussed in modern teaching, yet it may be one of the clearest pictures Scripture gives us of what obedience costs when heaven asks something almost unbearable of its most faithful servants. There is a detail in the Book of Giants, one of the Dead Sea Scroll fragments found at Qumran, that rarely makes it into modern teaching, and it changes how we should picture this entire confrontation. The giants themselves, the offspring born of the Watchers and their human wives, began having dreams before their destruction came. Two of them, named in the fragments as Ohia and Haya, saw visions of a tablet being dipped in water, then erased, symbolizing the complete blotting out of everything their existence represented. They understood, even before it happened, that their kind was never meant to last. This detail matters because it tells us the giants themselves sensed the coming judgment, and if they sensed it, their mothers, the wives who had borne them, must have sensed it too. The fragments describe the giants growing increasingly desperate as these dreams continued, seeking out Enoch himself to interpret what they meant, hoping the vision could somehow be reversed. Enoch's response, according to the surviving text, offered no comfort. The judgment had already been set in motion, and nothing the giants could do would change its course. This tells us something profound about how these events unfolded, not as a sudden, unexpected strike from heaven, but as the slow closing of a door left open for a long time, giving every party involved time to sense what was coming, even if they could not stop it. Picture what that must have felt like. A woman drawn into something she likely did not fully understand when it began, watching her own children grow into beings the earth itself could not sustain, slowly realizing that whatever future she imagined had already been sealed by choices made far above her, in realms she had no authority to resist. This is not a comfortable picture, and Scripture does not try to make it comfortable. Ezekiel 18 tells us that the soul who sins shall die, and that the son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father the guilt of the son, a principle of individual responsibility running throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. And yet Enoch describes a judgment that seems to cut across generations entirely, consuming mother and child together in the same act of purification. How do we hold these two truths at once? Perhaps the answer lies in what these wives had actually become by the time Michael was sent. This was not simple guilt by association. The knowledge given by the Watchers had reshaped them at a level Scripture treats as more than moral, more like ontological. Enoch describes them learning enchantments, root cutting, and the working of metals into idols and ornaments used to draw others further into the same corruption. If this is accurate, these women had not remained passive recipients of a gift they never asked for. They had become active participants, teachers themselves, spreading what they had learned to daughters and granddaughters, embedding the corruption deeper into the human family with every generation that passed. Judgment in this light was not falling on innocent bystanders. It was falling on a corrupted lineage that had, by choice or by transformation, become something Scripture could no longer categorize as fully human. The Sibylline Oracles, a collection of prophetic writings that blend Jewish and early Christian tradition, describe this period using apocalyptic language, painting a picture of an earth so saturated with violence and false worship that divine intervention became the only remaining option. The oracles speak of giants who were destroyed by the hand of the Almighty because their pride had reached the heavens itself, an image that echoes the Tower of Babel long before Babel was ever built. This suggests the corruption of the Watchers' era was not an isolated event, but the first instance of a pattern that would repeat throughout Scripture: human pride reaching upward, being met by divine correction reaching downward again and again across the centuries. Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon still holds 3 limestone blocks known as the trilithon, each weighing well over 800 tons, cut and placed with a precision that continues to baffle engineers who study ancient construction methods. Local tradition in the region has long associated the site with giants, claiming it was built before the flood by beings of enormous strength who left before the waters came. We cannot say with certainty that this site connects directly to the Watcher's account, but the persistence of this tradition across cultures, this shared memory of giants and impossible construction predating recorded history, deserves more attention than it typically receives from mainstream scholarship, which tends to dismiss it outright, rather than investigating why so many ancient cultures preserved nearly identical memories independently of one another. Puma Punku, high in the Bolivian mountains, presents the same puzzle in a different form. Its stones show cuts so precise that modern tools struggle to replicate them, and the surrounding oral tradition speaks of a race that existed before the current age of man, wiped out by catastrophic flooding. Half a world away from Lebanon, with no historical contact between the two cultures, we find nearly the same story repeating itself: giants, impossible construction, and a flood that ended everything. Coincidence becomes harder to argue, for the more these parallel accounts accumulate across continents that had no way of communicating with each other. Job chapter 1 gives us a rare glimpse into the structure of the heavenly court, describing the sons of God presenting themselves before the Lord and Satan coming among them. This tells us heaven operates with a level of order and accountability that even adversarial beings must submit to. The Watchers who descended to Hermon broke this order entirely, abandoning their assigned place rather than remaining within it. And everything that followed, the giants, the wives, the corruption spreading across the earth, was the direct consequence of beings refusing to stay within the boundaries God had established for them. This is why Michael's task cannot be separated from a much larger principle running through all of Scripture: that boundaries exist for a reason, and that crossing them, whether by angels abandoning their domain or by humans reaching for knowledge never meant to be theirs, always produces consequences that ripple far beyond the initial choice. The wives of the Watchers stood at the center of this rippling consequence, caught between a corruption they did not fully create and a judgment that could not simply pass them by once the corruption had taken root within them. Their story, buried for centuries beneath layers of canonical selection and institutional caution, forces us to confront how seriously Scripture takes the separation between heaven and earth, and how far heaven was willing to go to restore what had been broken. What remains after all of this? After Azazel bound beneath the rocks of Dudael, after the giants consumed by their own violence, after the wives faced with a judgment Scripture barely lets us look at directly, is a warning still relevant today. The boundary between what belongs to heaven and what belongs to earth was never meant to be treated carelessly, and every generation that forgets this lesson finds itself, in one form or another, standing exactly where those wives once stood. There is one more piece of this account that deserves careful attention before we reach its conclusion, and it concerns not what happened to the wives, but what happened after, in the generations that followed the flood. Because the corruption Michael was sent to address did not vanish entirely from human memory the moment the waters receded. Genesis chapter 6 makes a curious statement, almost slipped in without explanation, telling us that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. That single word, afterward, has troubled careful readers for centuries, because it suggests something continued or returned well beyond the boundaries of the flood itself. Numbers chapter 13 gives us the next glimpse, when the spies sent into Canaan returned terrified, describing men of great stature, the sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim. This is generations after Noah, long after the flood was supposed to have ended this particular corruption for good. And yet here they are again, giants walking the land, tall enough that the spies said they felt like grasshoppers standing beside them. If the flood was meant to be a complete reset, why do we find this bloodline resurfacing in the very land God was preparing to give his people? Some ancient commentators suggest a second, smaller incursion took place after the flood, a partial repeat of what happened on Hermon, though Scripture gives us far less detail about this second wave than it does about the first. This raises a question that unsettles even seasoned readers of these texts. If Michael's judgment against the Watchers' wives was meant to sever this corruption completely, how did any trace of it survive the flood at all? One possible answer lies in the very structure of Noah's family itself, and the suspicion recorded in the Genesis Apocryphon about whether Noah's own bloodline remained entirely untouched. If even a trace of this corrupted knowledge passed through the flood, hidden within a family line otherwise considered pure, then its resurfacing generations later in Canaan would make a terrible kind of sense, a seed buried deep enough to survive judgment, only to sprout again once conditions allowed. Deuteronomy chapter 3 tells us that Og, king of Bashan, was the last remaining survivor of the Rephaim, another name closely associated with the giant bloodlines, and that his bed, made of iron, measured over 13 feet in length. This is not folklore inserted for dramatic effect. This is presented in Scripture with the same matter-of-fact tone used to describe city walls and border territories, a historical detail meant to convey scale, not myth. Whatever happened on Hermon, whatever Michael accomplished in confronting the wives and binding the corruption at its root, it seems the shadow of that rebellion followed the human story for centuries afterward, resurfacing in pockets across the ancient Near East, until God commanded Israel to drive these bloodlines out entirely during the conquest of Canaan. This changes how we should read Michael's original assignment. It was not simply a single act of judgment that closed the door on this chapter forever. It was the first and most decisive strike against a corruption that heaven understood might resurface, might attempt to take root again in different forms, in different generations, requiring renewed vigilance every time it appeared. This is why the conquest narratives in Joshua, so often read purely as territorial conflict, carry an undertone of something far older and more spiritual, a continuation of the same battle Michael waged against the Watchers' wives, fought now on the ground by human hands under divine command. Ephesians chapter 6 reminds us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Paul writes this centuries after the events on Hermon, yet the language echoes precisely what Enoch described happening in those early days, a battle that was never merely physical, always rooted in a spiritual rebellion that manifested itself in physical consequences on earth. This tells us something crucial about how to understand Michael's role across the entirety of Scripture. He is not simply a warrior called upon occasionally for dramatic battles. He is the appointed guardian, standing at the boundary between what heaven permits and what heaven forbids, called into action whenever that boundary is threatened, whether the threat comes wearing the face of a fallen angel or the face of an empire rising against God's people centuries later. It is worth pausing here to consider what this means for how we read the rest of Scripture's conflicts, the wars, the exiles, the empires rising and falling around Israel. If Paul saw spiritual principalities standing behind earthly kingdoms, then perhaps every major confrontation recorded in the historical books carries this same double layer, a visible battle on the ground and an invisible one fought over the same boundary Michael first defended against the Watchers. This does not diminish the reality of human history. It deepens it, suggesting the choices nations made were never disconnected from the older rebellion that began on Hermon's summit. Daniel chapter 10 gives us perhaps the clearest picture of this ongoing struggle, describing a scene where an angelic messenger tells Daniel that he was delayed 21 days by the prince of the kingdom of Persia, a spiritual force opposing him, until Michael, described here as one of the chief princes, came to help him. This passage reveals something remarkable, that the battle Michael fought against the Watchers' wives was never an isolated event confined to the ancient past. It was part of a continuous pattern, a war fought in realms invisible to human eyes, with consequences that shape nations and empires long after the original rebellion took place. Every generation faces its own version of this boundary crossing, its own temptation to reach for what was never meant to belong to human hands. And every generation needs its own reminder of what happened the first time heaven allowed that boundary to be crossed without correction. What strikes me most, returning to this account after everything we have covered, is how quietly this story has been kept from most modern believers. Not erased entirely, since fragments of it remain scattered through Genesis, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Jude, and 2 Peter, but rarely assembled into the full picture Enoch, Jubilees, and the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve for us. Perhaps this silence exists because the story is uncomfortable, forcing us to reckon with a spiritual reality far stranger and more dangerous than the simplified version most churches teach. Perhaps it exists because institutions preferred a tidier narrative, one without giants, without corrupted wives, without an archangel forced to carry out judgment nobody wanted to discuss. Either way, the pieces remain, waiting in these ancient texts for anyone willing to look closely enough to reassemble what was almost lost. As we move toward the conclusion of this account, one question remains worth sitting with. If heaven was willing to intervene this directly, this decisively, to correct a rebellion this severe, what does that tell us about how seriously the boundary between the sacred and the corrupted is still being watched today? What Michael carried out on that mountain still echoes through every page of Scripture that speaks of boundaries between heaven and earth. The wives, the giants, Azazel bound in darkness, all of it points to a truth easy to forget in comfortable times, that God protects what is sacred no matter the cost. If this hidden history stirred something in you, if you felt the weight of a world nearly lost before the flood, our premium illustrated biblical mystery guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, takes you even deeper into the watchers, the giants, and everything Scripture only hints at. The link is waiting in the first pinned comment below. Thank you for watching all the way through. Subscribe, like this video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and stay close, because the next hidden chapter is already on its way to your screen.